everybody. Welcome back. I'm Hutch, and this is Schola Fides, a channel that is about theology for everyone. And the reason for that is that you're already a theologian. The only question is whether or not you are a God-honoring and Christ-exalting one. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about how I found Jordan Peterson. I know that doesn't seem like a theological topic on its face, and for this video it's really not going to be. But there is going to be a couple of future videos that we're going to talk a little bit about Jordan Peterson's theology and see if we can't come to some conclusions at any rate there. So here's kind of how I found Jordan Peterson, and this is going to be a little bit of an involved story, but I hope you'll stick with me, okay? So a number of years ago, I met a lady named Dr. Valerie Hobbs, who is from the University of Sheffield in England, and she is a brilliant woman and scholar who teaches in the graduate program in applied linguistics at Sheffield. And so she's really concerned and continues to be concerned about how we talk to women and about women in the evangelical church, broadly speaking, particularly from the pulpit. And she's done some really intriguing research there. And so if you guys aren't familiar with Dr. Hobbs, I recommend you check her out because she's doing some interesting stuff. But her work led me to looking into how we speak to men and how we speak about men in the evangelical and Reformed church, in much the same way I hope that Dr. Hobbs is doing. Now, obviously, my field isn't applied linguistics, so she has better training and probably some better insight there than I do. I'm certainly more than willing to admit that. But it was looking into how we talk to men and about men in the evangelical church that kind of started me down this path. So I was already kind of peripherally aware of the men's rights movement. So, for example, A Voice for Men and Paul Elam, who runs that particular website. Admittedly, Paul Elam is a bit of a provocateur. He's a bit of a gadfly, and so he tends to get misrepresented in some of what he has to say. But that also led me to the Honey Badgers and Honey Badger Radio, specifically to Hannah Wallen and Karen Strachan. Once again, for those of you who aren't aware of Honey Badger Radio or the Honey Badgers, interesting group of ladies. Very focused and very driven to speak about men's rights and issues that uniquely and disproportionately affect men. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think it was by way of Karen Strachan that I actually kind of tripped over Jordan Peterson, at least initially, although to be perfectly fair, it didn't stick. So her YouTube channel is Girl Writes What? And if I recall correctly, I believe that she interviewed Dr. Peterson, and I think, though I'm not 100% certain, that interview may have been about the MGTOW phenomenon, so men going their own way. And then that led me into looking into some stuff from Dr. Helen Smith, who's at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and some of her thoughts about men and where things are culturally with men right now. She's written a really good book called Men on Strike that really intrigued me and kind of caught my attention. And then that, in turn, led me to hearing about Cassie Jaye and her documentary, The Red Pill, commonly referred to now as the Red Pill movie. And so it is an incredible film that was released back in 2016, and it was interesting on multiple levels. It was interesting in that it was sort of a narrative of Cassie Jaye's own journey from beginning as this young lady who was looking to do a documentary on rape culture. And then that led her kind of into discovering Paul Elam and A Voice for Men, kind of like, oh, okay, are these the misogynists and the rape culture apologists that I've been hearing about? And so it follows her journey from there to, at the end of the film, saying that she no longer calls herself a feminist. Now, once again, to be very fair to Cassie Jaye, she doesn't call herself a men's rights advocate either. And so the film, on another level, was interesting because I think it brought out those areas that uniquely and disproportionately affect men in a very in a way that's very easy to watch and very easy to hear. And in some ways, her film is interesting because it really does prove a certain aspect of the men's rights movement's narrative, that when it comes to a lot of questions and a lot of issues, female voices really are privileged over male voices. So in my estimation, it's vastly more likely that the average person who is watching this video on YouTube has heard of Karen Strachan than it is that they've heard of Dr. Warren Farrell. And Dr. Farrell was another big influence as I started looking into some of the issues surrounding men broadly speaking in the culture, and then trying to take some of what I learned from these places and apply it to the church. He's written an excellent book called The Myth of Male Power, and another one called Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say. Both of which are excellent books, though getting your hands on a copy of The Myth of Male Power is next to impossible now. It's currently out of print, and it really needs to be brought back into print so that it can get a wider readership. And in my estimation, the wider readership that it very much deserves. But the fact that Miss Jaye's film or documentary was released in 2016, I think is significant because 2016 was in a lot of ways a really watershed year, where I think that a lot of the larger cultural issues that we're facing in the West, generally speaking, that had been bubbling sort of below the surface began to boil over. And I think that you could see that in a number of areas. You can see it with Brexit. You can see it with the election of Donald Trump. You can see it with the election of Salvini in Italy. You can see it in the way that really for the first time Viktor Orban of Hungary kind of exploded into the American consciousness as well. But the two big watershed moments for me in 2016 were Cassie Jaye's The Red Pill, and then seeing Jordan Peterson just go through this meteoric rise. And I think that those two are in some ways the most interesting because of the parallel that exists between them. And so when The Red Pill was released, there was this massive cultural backlash to Miss Jaye's film. There were protests all over the place. The film was banned from a number of theaters. There were huge protests in Australia, which I'm going to come back to in a second. And then there were, all sorts of ad hominem attacks on Cassie Jaye. In my estimation, I think David Futrell was behind a lot of that. And then there was the significant misrepresentation of Cassie Jaye and of the Red Pill movie that we saw in legacy media. And at the same time, Jordan Peterson gets up late at night because he can't sleep, and he records this series of videos called Professor Against Political Correctness, where he was talking through kind of his thoughts on the Bill C-16 in Canada. And then we saw this same thing, this resultant cultural backlash, and we saw the protests, outside his classroom, and I think in his classroom as well. I can't really remember that. That then led to him going outside and continuing to speak. I think he was standing on a bench there on campus at the University of Toronto, and folks were trying to shout him down, and he was doing his best to engage with them. And then again with Dr. Peterson, you saw the same sort of massive misrepresentation of him that started to show up in legacy media. And I think that the connection between this response in legacy media really cannot and should not be dismissed or overlooked, because there was a significant misrepresentation of both Cassie J and Jordan Peterson, whether that was at a personal level or whether that was at a level of content, right? At the level of what it is that they were saying, that was to be found in legacy media and along the same lines. And so that pointed out, at least to me, or it made me suspect at any rate, that there was a similar ideological substructure or underpinning that was driving the response to both of them. And so with Jay, you had this criticism that, she's giving men's rights advocates a platform, and these are, evil, wicked, neo-Nazi, woman-hating, neckbeards. And they, how dare you allow them to speak for themselves. And then with Jordan Peterson, you had a very similar criticism early on, which was that his audience was primarily composed of men, of white men, of angry young white men, and oh, that's so dangerous. And look, you're speaking to these people, and they're crazy and talking about crazy stuff, and so that means you're crazy too because they like you. And then you had, I think in both cases, what I could really only describe as the same sort of finger wagging from the same groups of people. And I think that you saw that so clearly in the media, where, the Weekend Sunrise interview in Australia with Cassie J was almost unbelievable, where on the one hand you had these talking heads that were on this news show that were claiming that they had watched Jay's film, and at the same time were demonstrating that they hadn't. Or that if they had, everything that she had to say and everything that the men's rights activists or advocates had to say in that film went right over their head, or maybe put otherwise, it just didn't penetrate. And then at the same time, we saw a very similar sort of interaction on BBC News 4 with Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman. And I think that Kathy Newman interview was really the moment where, for Jordan Peterson, the afterburners kicked on, and his popularity and his notoriety really exploded. And so I think that there are some explanations that might give us some answers to Dr. Peterson's sort of meteoric rise, or this explosion that he's experienced into the cultural consciousness in the English-speaking world for sure, but also outside of it, obviously. I think that one explanation is that Dr. Peterson is very much reintroducing people on a very significant level and in a very important way to the deep story of Western civilization and Western culture. And I think that you can see that in the way that he talks about the importance of the biblical narratives and their place in the history of Western civilization, and how they form this sort of undergirding or underpinning for the way that our civilization has been built. That is on its face just bound to be controversial, because especially given the cultural milieu in the United States, where there's this backlash against anybody who talks about America as a Christian nation, or founding America as a Christian nation. And admittedly, I will say up front, I do think that is debatable in some ways, and in other ways I think it's not. I think that another thing that kind of explains his explosion onto the scene is that, yes, his political discussions are interesting, and it was talking about politics that sort of made the camera pan in or pan over and focus in on him. And I think that his discussion of political issues is certainly interesting, but in my estimation, it's his discussion of political issues that's actually the least interesting thing that he has to say. Because ultimately, in the big picture, if you listen to the body of Dr. Peterson's work that's available online, the vast majority of what he has to say is really adjacent to politics at best. And I don't think it's fair to consider him a political thinker, because the vast majority of what he has to say is really just a lot bigger than politics. It is much bigger. I think another piece of the puzzle is that the man is a genuinely engaging and very interesting speaker. And the fact that he has been lecturing and teaching undergraduates and that sort of thing for decades is obvious. And he is obviously a very engaging lecturer. I mean, go and watch the videos of his classes that he's put on YouTube. Personality and Its Transformations is an excellent example of that, because he's dealing with some deep concepts there, and his students are just zeroed in, super engaged. And he's able to hold that attention through the whole class. And I think that maybe most importantly, what explains this is that he is tapping into something culturally that is much bigger than simply issues surrounding things like, the use of pronouns when speaking with, transgender people, or the relationship between men and women and the innate biological differences that exist there. And I think that if that were all he was talking about, then his 15 minutes of fame would have been up by now. And so I think the fact that he hasn't just kind of dropped out of the public eye or public awareness, that his popularity has not begun to plummet, demonstrates that. So the big question is, what is it that he's tapping into? Because that's the question that I've had from the beginning, since I kind of first saw him, especially when I saw the lectures that he was doing on the biblical narratives when he was walking through Genesis. Because that was very, very different, what was happening there. The fact that he was, speaking to an audience of several hundred people about a biblical narrative, and I would dare say that the vast majority of them were not Christians, and yet he had hooked them and had gotten their attention and was holding it for an hour and a half plus. And so that's the question that I want to start to examine the next time that we do a video together here at Schola Fides. I want to thank you guys for tuning in and for not abandoning me. I've been out of town this past week visiting family out of state, so I, once again, just super sorry that I wasn't able to get anything up while I was out of town, but I've also been sick as a dog, and I think you can probably still hear it some in my voice, but do have some other stuff that I've got planned to go up this week, Tuesday and Thursday, so please hang around, and you'll get to check that out, all right? Thanks for watching. Y'all take it easy. Hey everybody, thank you so much for sticking around for the end of the video. If you guys are being helped, please subscribe to the channel. If you have questions that you would like to ask, feel free to leave them in the comments thread below. And once again, thank you guys so much for all of your support. I look forward to seeing you again next time. God bless.